Welcome to the recorded webinar on Civil Rights Requirements in the Child and Adult Care Food Program, or CACFP. This training is designed to provide new and existing CACFP sponsors with detailed information on their responsibility to assure that benefits of the CACFP are made available to all eligible participants in a non-discriminatory manner, and the supporting documentation that must be maintained to support these efforts. This applies to both child care and adult care facilities, as well as sponsors of the at-risk after-school meals component of the CACFP and family daycare home sponsors. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to your responsibility to your participants, which would generally be the children and/or adults in your care. However, please note that because of the nature of our programs, participants often have a parent or guardian acting on their behalf, and for the purpose of this presentation, when I refer to participants, I mean both the actual children or adults in your care and any person legally acting on their behalf. This presentation is most appropriate for administrative staff involved in policy development and implementation of policies as they relate to the CACFP. Regulations surrounding civil rights in USDA-funded programs cover all of the federally funded child nutrition programs, from the National School Lunch, Breakfast, and Special Milk programs to the Summer Food Service Program, the Food Distribution Program, and the Child and Adult Care Food Program. Any sponsor who receives federal funding is required to adhere to civil rights regulations and guidelines in order to be eligible to participate in the program. It's important to note that if your organization participates in a federally funded program, any amount of federal dollars that come into one part of your organization open up the entire organization to the responsibility of ensuring civil rights in terms of equal access and treatment of participants in your overall programming. The overall goal when we talk about civil rights within the federally funded child nutrition programs, including the Child and Adult Care Food Program, is to ensure equal treatment and access for all current and prospective participants. To ensure that this is happening, we need to make all prospective participants aware of their rights. We need to eliminate any barriers, real or perceived, that might prevent participation, and we need to ensure that we are treating people overall with dignity and respect. Throughout this presentation, we will review the ways to achieve these goals through civil rights compliance.
When we talk about civil rights, we are referring specifically to treatment of the protected classes as listed on this slide. The federally protected civil classes are race, color, national origin, sex, including gender identity and sexual orientation, age, and disability. Additionally, the Rhode Island Department of Education does not discriminate on the basis of any of the protected classes listed.
As I mentioned, any sponsor who participates in a federally funded program is required to adhere to civil rights regulations, and as an extension of that, any parties who enter into contracts where federal funds will be exchanged are required to have assurances that all parties involved will also comply with civil rights regulations. So this means that the agreements between RIDE and our CACFP sponsors need to include that assurance, which they do, and then any additional agreements between the sponsor and contracted vendors, like a food service management company or other food vendor, also need to contain those assurances. Really, anyone who is involved with the overall flow of the federal funds needs to commit to adhering to civil rights regulations. So the very first part of ensuring that a successful program is correctly implementing civil rights guidelines is to make sure that all staff are well trained. Training starts from the top down. It starts with our partners at the USDA who provide training to the state agency, and then we at the state agency provide training to you, our local sponsors, who will then be responsible for going out and training your frontline staff who are actually responsible for administering the operational aspect of the program on a daily basis. Per federal guidance, there are 9 areas at a minimum for which each sponsor is responsible for receiving and providing training on for civil rights. And these are the topics that we will cover throughout this presentation, which are collection and use of data, effective public notification systems, complaint procedures, conflict resolution, compliance review techniques, resolution of noncompliance, requirements for reasonable modifications for persons with disabilities, requirements for language assistance, and customer service.
The first topic area that we will review is collection and use of data. It's a requirement of the CACFP that each participating sponsor collect racial and ethnic data on its participants at least once annually. In the CACFP, racial and ethnic data are generally collected via the annual beneficiary data form. The meal benefit application, which families are generally asked to complete annually, does include a section where participants can self-identify. However, many participants will choose either not to self-identify or not to return a meal benefit application at all. So while this is considered to be the most accurate way to gather racial and ethnic data, it is not always the most practical way. If your organization collects racial ethnic data on other internal forms, the data collected can be used to fill out the annual beneficiary data form for CACFP if the same ethnic and racial categories are used. This information must be collected and maintained for a minimum of 3 years plus the current year and must be accessible to the state agency or the USDA upon request. Importantly, in May 2021, the USDA rescinded the use of visual identification for participants who do not self-identify. If racial ethnic data was not provided on the meal benefit application, sponsors should write unknown on the meal benefit application. When filling out the annual beneficiary data form, if sponsors do not have racial ethnic data submitted by the families, they can use census data for the town or city where the site is located. Again, participants are not required to self-identify ethnic or racial information. However, self-identification is generally the preferred method of data collection. Sponsors are encouraged to work with participants to explain why they are being asked for this information and what it's used for, which is to show at the site level how well your program is reaching each of the different populations within your community. This can be important should you receive a civil rights complaint or even in preventing a civil rights complaint. The information collected is maintained by you, the sponsor, and is not sent to RIDE or to the USDA. RIDE or the USDA may request racial and ethnic data information from a sponsor to help establish the validity of a civil rights complaint. So if a participant were to indicate that they thought they were being discriminated on based on their race, and your racial and ethnic data either wasn't available or indicated that there was a very low level of participation in your program from that racial group, that might help sustain that complaint. On a local level, this information can be used for your purposes as a sponsor to help identify any needs in terms of additional resources that participants might need to help them access your program, including translated materials, etc. So it's an important piece of information to be collected. It's a requirement of the program, but it's not something that is reported further up the line that your participants should be concerned about providing.
Racial and ethnic data are captured separately, and we will generally start by classifying participants into one of the two ethnic categories. Hispanic or Latino is the first category, and the second is not Hispanic or Latino. Every participant will fall into one of these two categories. So, if you have 100 participants, you should have 100 people listed in total as either Hispanic or Latino, or not Hispanic or Latino.
The next step would be to collect racial data. In addition to falling into one of the two ethnic categories, every person will also fall into at least one of the racial categories listed on the screen, which are American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. Some participants will identify as more than one of these racial categories, but each participant should be identified in at least one of these categories. So if you have 100 participants, you should have 100 people total listed in your ethnicity section and 100 or more in the racial category. If a family chooses not to self-identify on the meal benefit application, you would mark the race ethnicity as unknown. This slide shows an example of 100 participants at a center. The top ethnicity box shows that the total number of either Hispanic Latino or non-Hispanic Latino participants will equal 100, since all participants will fall into one of the two categories. However, the race box shows the number of racial identities in total is over 100, since in this example, several participants identify as more than one race.
The second topic that we will review is effective public notification systems. An effective public notification system will include these three main components: a description of program availability, a description of complaint information, and the full USDA non-discrimination statement, which actually will include the procedures for filing a complaint. There are certain methods of communication that are required for sponsors as part of their participation in the Child and Adult Care Food Program. The first is a public media release, which in the case of existing sponsors of the CACFP, RIDE releases a blanket statement on behalf of the entire state at the beginning of each school year, so this isn't a requirement that you would need to be concerned with. But any new sponsor joining the program will be required to issue a media release prior to being approved for participation. The second requirement is the posting of the And Justice for All poster. This poster must be current and must be placed in a conspicuous area that is customer facing, meaning that people that are participating in your program are able to see and read the information presented on the poster. There are other methods of communication that are optional that you might elect to use when advertising your program, such as flyers, brochures, radio ads, etc. These are all great ways to communicate and make sure that you are reaching the entire population of prospective participants. However, it is not a requirement that you advertise specifically in these ways. It's important to remember, though, that if your center is advertising in general for enrollment in your care program, whether through a website or any other of the methods that I've mentioned, you should be sure to include the availability of CACFP meals in your advertisement to ensure that all potential participants are made aware of the program benefits that would be available to them. If any agency advertisements or communications include vital program information, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, then the full USDA non-discrimination statement must be included in the communication, or you must have received approval to use the shortened non-discrimination tagline. But either way, your program materials must include a statement of non-discrimination. In order to be compliant with federal requirements, a public media release must include the information as shown on this slide. Program eligibility requirements, what benefits and services are offered, like the availability of free breakfast, lunch, and/or snack, depending on your operation, how and when the program is available, the rights and responsibility of applicants, the procedures for filing a complaint, which again are included in the non-discrimination statement, but you should also include any local procedures that you might have, the non-discrimination statement, and then any kind of programmatic change. So for instance, if you normally offer breakfast, lunch, and snack, but you've stopped serving snack under the program, you want to make sure that people are made aware of this to minimize potential for complaints if a participant is not able to receive the services that they thought were available.
The And Justice for All poster is something that existing program operators should be familiar with, though it is occasionally updated and may look different, as pictured on the screen, than previous versions that you are aware of. All sites that participate in a federally funded child nutrition program must display this poster, and it must be posted somewhere that participants can easily access and read it. It needs to be displayed in a location that all participants will come in contact with at some point during the day. So for many centers, this would be the front desk or lobby area, but if your center is set up in a way that participants are able to enter the building directly into the room that they're receiving care in, and they never access a communal area, in that case, the poster would be required in each individual room. Posters are only acceptable in the 11 by 17 format, and you can obtain copies of the poster from RIDE. You should not be making any local reproductions of this poster. Also, these posters are updated periodically, and your center is responsible for displaying the most current version, which, as of the date of this recording in 2023, should match what is pictured on the screen. If you have an outdated version, which will likely be in red, white, and blue, and/or will include a picture of the Statue of Liberty, you should remove this version and contact RIDE for a copy of the most current poster.
Now we will move on and discuss the use of the USDA non-discrimination statement. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned the term vital program documents. Vital documents are any documents that include information regarding the availability of program benefits. So, for instance, mentioning the availability of free meals upon enrollment would be notification of program benefits. For the purposes of the Child and Adult Care Food Program, situations where the full non-discrimination statement would be required include the free and reduced price meal benefit application, family handbooks, which should discuss the availability of the program, employee handbooks for the same reason, any print advertisements, like we talked about earlier, and any websites for your CARE program. Again, the website for your CARE program should include information on the availability of meals through the CACFP, and therefore would be required to include either the full non-discrimination statement on the primary page that discusses the food program or a hyperlink to the statement. The hyperlink cannot be linked to a closed document, meaning a PDF or a Word file format. It would have to bring you directly to a web page with the non-discrimination statement. When using the non-discrimination statement, you need to make sure that the statement is no smaller than the smallest font in whatever document you are producing, and also that you haven't changed the wording or structure of the statement. I will show you what the full statement looks like on the next slide, and you want to maintain that top to bottom structure as you'll see on the slide. There are some situations in which your program documents will not require the full non-discrimination statement and could receive permission to use the shortened tag, which states, "This institution is an equal opportunity provider." Currently, the only approved blanket use of that statement in Rhode Island is for program menus. But there are other situations in which you might just be saying, "We offer nutritious meals as part of our regular programming," or something to that effect, and that's not necessarily a vital piece of information about the program, since it doesn't speak at all to accessibility of benefits or eligibility requirements. So if you have materials that include that kind of generic statement, but do still reference the program, they may qualify for use of the shortened tag. Anything that you have questions on, you'll need to get approval through the RIDE office, and we'll actually have to send it up the line for approval from the USDA office to make sure that use of the shortened tag is appropriate. When in doubt, or if you have not received approval, you will need to use the full non-discrimination statement.
This is the full USDA non-discrimination statement. Please be reminded that this statement is updated periodically by the USDA, though the current version will likely look very similar to past versions. As of the date of this recording in September 2023, the version shown on the screen represents the most recent update, which occurred in May 2022. Something that we commonly see is that sponsors will carry forward program documents, including the non-discrimination statement, like a family handbook, from prior years, and that the non-discrimination statement is an outdated version that has just been carried forward year over year. So please be sure to check all of your materials to make sure that if you are using a RIDE template, that you have the most current version, which should include the updated non-discrimination statement if required, or that your local materials that include the non-discrimination statement have been updated to include the most current version. Again, even when updated, this statement will likely look very similar to previous versions, and it can be difficult to tell if you are using the most current version. So a best practice would be to ensure that each year when RIDE releases new template documents, that you discard any older versions that you have printed, and that you copy and paste the non-discrimination statement directly from a RIDE template into your local documents if necessary.
One other area to consider as we talk about non-discrimination is to use images that reflect diversity when you are using imagery to communicate about your food program, and a sample of that can be seen on the screen. The next area that we'll cover is complaint procedures. Each sponsor of the Child and Adult Care Food Program is encouraged to develop and implement a written procedure to handle discrimination complaints. Occasionally, sponsors will have existing policies in place that speak to civil rights expectations for the overall organization, but not necessarily as it pertains to the food program. The requirements that we are going to discuss will pertain specifically to the CACFP. So, if a sponsor has an existing civil rights policy, they could choose to compare these requirements to the existing policy and update as necessary to ensure that these minimum requirements are being met. Or a sponsor could develop a separate civil rights policy that is specific to the CACFP. A civil rights complaint is a complaint that alleges discrimination based on one of those protected classes that we discussed earlier. Discrimination can occur when a participant is delayed benefits, denied benefits, treated differently, or given disparate treatment. There are multiple ways that a participant can file a complaint of discrimination. They can go directly to you as the sponsor, they can come to RIDE directly, or they can actually go directly to the USDA with that information provided on the non-discrimination statement. We would encourage that sponsors work with participants to resolve complaints at the lowest level possible. But regardless of the outcome of a discussion that you have with a potential civil rights complaint, it is your responsibility as a sponsor to ensure that each participant understands their right to file a complaint, even as you are working towards resolution. So when you are having these conversations, if someone were to call you and say that they felt they had been treated in a discriminatory manner, you should by all means work to get as much information as possible to resolve the complaint at the lowest level possible, but you need to make sure that the participant that you are speaking to fully understands their right to lodge a formal complaint, and that the end result of the conversation is that you and the participant both know what the intent is. Because if after speaking with you and getting clarification, the participant elects not to lodge a formal complaint, that's fine. But if they did want to move forward in the complaint process, you must then record that complaint and then also forward it to RIDE. So it's important that at the end of that conversation, both parties understand the intent so there's no miscommunication about whether or not a formal complaint should have been filed. Any person who is alleging discrimination based on one of the protected classes that we have discussed has the right to file a complaint within 180 days of the alleged discriminatory action. And this timeline can actually be extended for legitimate reasons as determined by the USDA. Complaints can be filed verbally. They do not need to be formally written. If that happens and you receive a complaint over the phone, it is the responsibility of the sponsor to document the complaint and then forward it to our office. By acknowledging and documenting a complaint, the sponsor is effectively accepting the complaint. Every effort should be made to have the complainant provide contact information, the specific location and/or organization delivering the service that the complaint is in reference to, the nature of the incident or action that led to the complaint, the basis on which the complainant feels discrimination exists based on one of those protected classes, contact information for any other person who may have knowledge of the alleged discriminatory action, and the dates during which the alleged action occurred. If you are unable to get all of this information, you will still need to record and accept the complaint, but you should try to get as much information as possible to help with the complaint resolution process. Once it has been accepted and recorded, that's when you would forward it to our office here at RIDE. So you will need to have a developed complaint form or access the USDA complaint form in order to formally record a complaint. Once recorded, you will enter any complaints into your complaint log and refer the complainant to whoever is your designated civil rights contact person within your organization. And then you will report the complaint to RIDE within 5 working days of receipt. Remember too that these complaints can not only be verbal, but they can also be anonymous. So if a person elects not to share their name, they can do that, but you should still record and forward the complaint with as much detail as you are able to get. In terms of documentation, you are encouraged to maintain a civil rights file that will contain both your procedures for filing a civil rights complaint, as well as blank copies of your civil rights complaint form. You should also maintain a contact list that indicates who within your organization should be contacted if a civil rights complaint is received, which would be maintained in this file as well. Separately, you will also need to maintain a civil rights complaint log. It's really important to maintain the confidentiality of these logs to prevent the accusation of reprisal for filing a civil rights complaint. So, any completed civil rights complaint forms and the complaint log should be filed separately from the other civil rights files, which should be accessible to anyone who might need to access a civil rights complaint form or your civil rights complaint procedures. And they should also be stored separately from any other operational complaints that are not related to civil rights that your organization might receive. Access to this log should be restricted and should generally be accessed only by your organization's designated civil rights point of contact. These logs must be dated and must be maintained for 3 years plus the current year, even if no complaints have been received. The next topic that we'll cover is conflict resolution. We find that many civil rights complaints actually arise from a misunderstanding, misinformation, or in some cases, poor customer service. It is often the reaction of sponsors to become nervous when civil rights issues are brought up, and they may elect not to engage with participants once the word discrimination is used. But it's really important that you get as much information as possible from your participants, and also that you try to determine the root of the problem to see if there is a resolution that can be worked towards. In many cases, if a participant feels heard and is able to clarify what the issue is, resolution can happen before a formal complaint is lodged. Just note that though we do encourage resolution at the lowest level and that you work with your participants, you in no way should discourage an individual from filing a complaint, and you must make them aware of their right to file a formal complaint. Now that you understand each of the civil rights requirements that we've discussed up until this point, which are the media release, general program communications, use of the non-discrimination statement, complaint procedures, and conflict resolutions, you'll want to make sure that you have a process in place to check compliance on an ongoing basis. So compliance during meal service, as far as civil rights are concerned, means that there is no separation based on any of those protected classes during mealtimes, seating arrangements, serving lines, or eating areas. We get a lot of questions on this because in many cases, a center's lunch periods are naturally separated by age group based on licensing requirements, but that means that there is separation based on one of those protected classes. So the answer to this would be that if your program already routinely outside of the CACFP separates participants for safety or organizational purposes as part of your general operating procedures, and they are not being separated specifically and only for mealtimes, then that would generally be okay. We recognize that there are some situations where a center might separate participants specifically at mealtimes for safety, such as the use of an allergy-free table. These situations should be used on a limited basis, shouldn't exclude participants from the overall eating environment, and they shouldn't be used for any purpose other than maintaining safety. The safety of your participants needs to be your primary concern at all times, and if the use of a segregated table is the best way to maintain that, then that's the way that it needs to be. But you need to make sure that the table isn't also used for, say, disciplinary purposes, because that would be changing your participants' treatment as far as the food program is concerned. So other areas of compliance include making translations of program materials available, displaying the And Justice for All poster, using the correct version of the non-discrimination statement on your program materials, correctly determining meal benefit applications and making sure that meal benefit applications aren't denied incorrectly, and if they are, that those denied applications aren't disproportionately comprised of minority populations, and that disabled participants are offered the same program benefits as all of your other participants. These are all items that should be reviewed in some way as either part of a formal monitoring visit or even just informally as you observe the daily operations of your program. It's important to make sure that compliance isn't just happening on paper through your civil rights policies and procedures, but that it's actually happening in practice by the people actually implementing your program on a daily basis. The next topic is resolution of noncompliance. If you were to go out and conduct a monitoring visit for one of your sites, or if RIDE staff were to come out and conduct a program review and we note noncompliance in one of the areas of civil rights that we just mentioned, you'd be required to submit a detailed plan of corrective action for each finding, and you would be expected to make those corrections immediately. Any failure to correct issues related to civil rights could result in termination from the program. The next section will review the requirement to make reasonable modifications for persons with disabilities. This is definitely a growing topic among youth especially, and we continually receive updated guidance on this topic, so we'll spend a little bit of time on this. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the regulations that govern the CACFP, as well as additional federal regulations that speak specifically to the treatment of persons with a disability. A disability, as is defined for the CACFP, would be a person who has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more of the major life activities. In 2008, the Americans with Disability Act was amended and expanded the definition of major life activities to include major bodily functions, such as your immune system, your digestive system, your neurological system, and your circulatory system. So what this means is that many ailments that were not previously considered to be disabilities in the CACFP would likely be considered to be disabilities under this expanded definition. For instance, participants with food allergies that are not life-threatening previously did not fall under the definition of a disability because it would not have impacted what was previously defined as a major life function. But now, with that expanded definition, which includes digestive functions, something like lactose intolerance could fall under the category of a disability. Because of this, CACFP sponsors are now required to make more meal modifications than would have been required under the previous definition. Effective modifications will provide equal opportunity for program participants and generally will include, where possible, substituting menu items with something that is nutritionally equivalent. So for example, if you are substituting a meat alternate because a participant is allergic to dairy, so maybe you are substituting the cheese on pizza, you should be trying to replace that with another meat alternate or another source of protein. An appropriate solution for a participant who has a lactose intolerance or milk allergy when the menued item is cheese pizza would not simply be to take the cheese off and only offer the grain, or to not offer the pizza at all. Those solutions would not really be substitutes at all and are definitely not nutritionally equivalent, so you would not be providing your participant with equal access to the benefits of your program. Determining what may or may not be a disability can be tricky, and really, it shouldn't be up to you. USDA guidance takes the onus off of individual participants for defining and proving a disability and focuses more on what you as a sponsor can do to make a reasonable modification. So you should not be attempting to determine whether any specific ailment qualifies as a disability, but should instead be focusing your efforts on accommodating and making modifications for the identified ailment. If there is an additional cost that is associated with making a particular modification, that cost cannot be charged to your participants. There might be some situations where participants will elect to contribute either a substitute component or in some cases financial assistance, and they can choose to do so, but they cannot be required to do that. Sponsors should consider and include provisions for meeting special dietary needs in their contracts with food service vendors and caterers if applicable. Modifications are not required to be an exact substitute as listed on a note by a physician. So for instance, if a physician were to say that a particular participant could not have cow's milk due to digestive issues and please substitute silk soy milk, it's not the sponsor's responsibility to necessarily provide specifically silk soy milk, but rather to provide an adequate substitute, which might be a different brand of soy milk or might be another dairy alternative like rice milk or almond milk. What's important is that you get clarification to understand why the modification is required. That way you know if you are providing as a substitute is adequate to ensure the safety of your participant. Even if you are in disagreement with a participant, so thinking about that example we just discussed, if the sponsor was not in a position to provide that specific brand name, but instead provides a substitute that meets the participant's needs, but the participant is unhappy with the modification, the sponsor still needs to make that modification as they work towards resolution with the participant. So just because you might be in disagreement on the best course of action, unless what you are doing could be harming the participant, don't stop making the modification. You still need to ensure equitable access as you work towards resolution. Substitutions made for participants with disabilities are allowable in reimbursable meals, even if those meals are outside of the USDA meal pattern, as long as the modification is supported by a medical statement signed by a licensed physician. And in some cases, as I mentioned earlier, participants may choose to provide one or more component themselves as part of a modification plan, and those meals can still be reimbursable as long as it's an agreement that has been made between the participant and the sponsor as the best way to move forward in making the required modification, and as long as it is clear to the participant that they are not required to provide their own modification. So again, looking back to that example that we discussed in the previous slide, if a participant's family decided that they wanted to provide the soy milk just to be sure that the participant is receiving the preferred brand, but they want the participant to receive all other meal components as provided by the sponsor, then you can allow that. You just need to make it clear again that the sponsor is willing and able to make a modification and it is not required of the parent to do so on their own. If, in that situation, the participant still chooses to provide their own modification, then it is allowable and the meal would still be considered to be reimbursable, so long as you maintain documentation of your discussions with the family. When accepting a medical statement from a participant to support a modification plan, the statement must include the food that needs to be avoided and a brief explanation of how the exposure will affect your participant. In the case of a food allergy, simply identifying that a participant may not have a specific food due to allergy reasons would be sufficient, though you may elect to request more information to ensure that you know the signs of a potential reaction and are prepared to act accordingly. Medical statements may also include recommended substitutes, but this is not a requirement, and a sponsor may choose not to make the exact substitute requested if an alternate option still meets the participant's needs. A medical statement needs to provide sufficient detail for you to make a safe modification, but it shouldn't provide specific diagnosis information, nor should you request that information. It would be a HIPAA violation for that information to be provided to unnecessary parties, and in this case, it's not really important what the specific ailment is, just the item to be avoided and why, so we can understand the full repercussions and what we can do to replace it. It is acceptable to seek clarification from a physician, although again, you should still be working to make a modification as you are seeking clarification, and you don't want to delve into anything too specific in terms of a diagnosis when seeking clarification. There may be some instances in which you receive a meal modification request that is not related to a disability. An example of that would be a modification request related to a lifestyle or religious preference. This would include things like requests for vegetarian meals or meals that meet other special diet requests like low carb, but that are not supported by a medical statement. Sponsors are encouraged but not required to make food substitutions for this type of request. If a sponsor elects to make a substitution based on lifestyle or religious preferences, then those substitutions must fall within the USDA meal pattern in order for the meal to be considered reimbursable. So generally this would be managed by simply offering alternate food selections within a specific meal component. So if you have a vegetarian population, you may offer a variety of meat alternate options that would be appropriate for vegetarians and non-vegetarians, so each participant is still receiving the meat alternate component as required by the meal pattern. They are simply receiving different food items within that component category. It's important to note that, as I mentioned before, with this expanded definition of disabilities, many things that may have been identified to a sponsor before that did not fall under the category of a disability may now be considered to be disabilities and would require modification upon request. So it's really important to communicate with participants about the process for requesting a meal modification, and then also to communicate internally with your staff, which we'll review a little bit more on the next slide. Procedurally, a sponsor needs to develop a procedure for requesting meal modifications. All staff who will be involved need to be trained on this procedure, and if an organization employs 15 or more people, there needs to be a 504 coordinator appointed to handle civil rights issues, including the coordination of meal modification requests. So, a sponsor may consider assembling a team for implementation, which might include the 504 coordinator, a nurse, a food service professional, or anyone else in your organization that might be involved in this process. You want to make sure that you are communicating clearly about these procedures with your participants. Again, this is about ensuring that there are no actual or perceived barriers to participation in your program. If a participant is suffering from a severe allergy and does not think that a sponsor can accommodate that particular allergy or does not know how to go about requesting a modification, this could be considered a barrier to participation in your program. So you need to make sure that you've communicated that there is a process in place for requesting meal modifications. You need to communicate the decision regarding the modification request, and you also need to include procedures for appealing a decision that is made based on a modification request. Participants need to be given the opportunity to examine records that are related to the decision regarding the modification request, and they should be given the right to file a grievance. There should be steps in place to provide for an impartial hearing, and there should also be a review process for these appeals. And again, if you are sending out these communications that include hearing notices or rights to appeal, you'll need to include the full USDA non-discrimination statement on those communications. We would highly recommend that sponsors make the information for requesting meal modifications a part of their regular enrollment process, as well as posting this information on any public website, and that you should refer to both your internal complaint procedures as well as the federal complaint procedures when providing any kind of information about a participant's rights. So, if your modification procedures include adverse notice of a modification request for a modification that cannot be made, which would be rare, but if that's the case, you would list both the sponsor's 504 coordinator as an appeal option and also the USDA intake office for the civil rights complaints.
Another best practice, outside of developing this policy and including it as part of your regular communications, would be working with your food service provider to develop a kind of game plan for accommodating the 9 most common allergens, which you'll see on this slide. It's important to note that each individual modification request needs to be treated separately, and you must avoid imposing your own personal biases and experiences on any other person's modification request. If you have a participant who is allergic to soy, for example, they may not need the exact same modification as a different participant who is allergic to soy. And you yourself might be allergic to soy, but you might experience it differently than your participant and might require different modifications. So while you may have a basic blueprint of how you would generally plan to accommodate this kind of request, you would want to follow up with the family to let them know that while you have a general plan for meal modifications for participants with an allergy to soy, you will work to understand how this plan may or may not fit in with that participant's specific needs, and you would start the conversation from there.
The next required topic is language assistance. Any recipient of federal funds has a responsibility to ensure meaningful access for all participants with limited English proficiency. Limited English proficiency, or LEP, is defined as individuals who do not speak English as their primary language and have limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. So this would not only include the population of participants that might speak a different language, but it could also include hearing impaired or illiterate participants. This is all about ensuring that you have the resources in place to provide access to each of your potential participants, and that is going to include providing translated materials and interpreters as necessary to make sure that all of your participants have access to program benefits and are aware of their rights. In some cases, sponsors may elect to use volunteers as interpreters to assist, which is acceptable, but it is very important that volunteers understand the ethics requirements of an interpreter, including confidentiality. Our programs deal with confidential income and other information, and it is important that not only do your participants understand their right to confidentiality, but that interpreters understand that as well. So these kinds of services need to be able to be provided at a local level in a way that is consistent and competent. That means it shouldn't be standard practice for somebody in the office who speaks a little bit of Spanish to get on the phone and attempt to act as a translator for program participants. That's not providing services in a competent way. It also means that services shouldn't be dependent on the scheduling of a part-time employee. So if you use a specific employee as translator, but they are only available a few days a week or every other week, that's not going to be a consistent way to provide services to your participants, and it's unacceptable to delay benefits just because you don't have the resources available at any given time. In some cases, a participant may elect to bring their own interpreter, which is acceptable again, as long as the confidentiality has been addressed and as long as the participant understands that it is not their responsibility. Just as with meal modifications, they are not required to provide their own services, but they may choose to do so. In this case, the arrangement needs to be acceptable not only to the participant, but also to the sponsor. It would not be acceptable for a participant to bring a translator and for that translator to speak solely on behalf of the participant seeking services, meaning that you don't see them conferring in their language at all. That would not be indicative of the program participant actually participating and understanding their rights. So you want to make sure that both parties are comfortable because ultimately the sponsor is responsible for ensuring that each participant is aware of their rights. And if you are in a situation where you see an interpreter who is not conferring with the participant that they represent, they may not be adequately relaying the rights of the participant to them, and that could come back as a civil rights complaint down the line. Lastly, children should really not be used as interpreters for all of the reasons described above, for confidentiality, for competency of services, and for ensuring that your participants really do have understanding of their rights, which would likely generally be outside of the comprehension level of a child. So, aside from translating services, this also means that sponsors must provide program materials in appropriate languages. A lot of times, a sponsor might say that they don't need to provide program materials in an alternate language because they've never received a request for such a thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have need. It might mean that you are just not reaching a particular population and they are not aware of your program at all, and that inadvertently a barrier has been created to accessing your program's benefits. So you want to make sure that as much as possible that translated materials are made available in a way that meets the makeup of your community and your potential participants, regardless of whether you've received specific requests for program materials in a particular language. And you should note that a shortage of resources does not alleviate a sponsor of the responsibility to provide translated materials. So, you may elect to share resources with other sponsors. You might train your bilingual staff to be interpreters, though you want to be aware of labor rules when you engage your staff to act as interpreters. You might also consider using language line services, or you might get support from local organizations throughout your community who can provide some of this assistance for you. Again, you just want to be aware of the confidentiality that we have discussed in the previous slide. And there is a link here on the bottom of the slide for USDA-provided prototype materials that are translated in many different languages, so most of your meal benefit application translation needs should be met through this link. While the translated meal benefit applications specifically reference the school meals program as opposed to the CACFP, these applications would still be appropriate for use in CACFP settings if need be. Our last topic for the civil rights training is customer service. This may not seem like a civil rights topic, but as I mentioned earlier, many civil rights complaints actually arise from poor customer service. So you want to make sure that your staff is not only well trained in the implementation of the requirements of civil rights, including each of the areas we've reviewed up until this point, but you also want to make sure that your staff are trained on general customer service skills that may affect the way that a participant feels they have been treated from a civil rights standpoint. So you want to have your staff ask themselves, how would they want to be addressed? Are they treating each participant in the same manner and in a manner that they would want to be treated? Has the participant been informed of exactly the information needed to make any kind of decision regarding program benefits? Have you given the person the opportunity to clarify and ask questions? And has the person been given all of the information necessary? This is important from a training standpoint, not only for those frontline staff, being the staff that are actually distributing meals, but also for staff at the administrative level who have responsibilities for making meal benefit determinations, or hearing officials, your civil rights coordinator, etc. Many times, if a person feels that they are being treated in a way that is rude, or if they feel that their concerns and complaints are not being heard, whether the concerns are specifically about civil rights or not, that can snowball into a bigger issue that may result in a civil rights complaint. Now that we've covered each of the required civil rights topics, let's look at a summary to-do list that you should take away from this training. You need to make sure that you are offering your child and adult care food program in a non-discriminatory manner. You will need to train your staff annually on civil rights, including both the staff who are responsible for directly passing out the meals as well as your administrative staff. These trainings need to be documented, so you need to save both a dated training sign-in sheet and an agenda, and the agenda needs to specifically reference civil rights as a topic. Civil rights training for these staff members should include information specific to the CACFP. You need to develop and fully implement your civil rights complaint procedures, including specific steps for reporting complaints. You should develop and communicate a policy for requesting meal modifications. You need to make sure that your civil rights complaint forms, logs, and procedures are available to your staff. You need to prominently display the most current version of the And Justice for All poster in an area where your participants can easily read it. You need to use the full and current version of the USDA non-discrimination statement on all vital program materials and the shortened tag anywhere that it's been approved for use. And you need to offer meals to all participants present on site at the time of meal service. If you do all of the things listed on this slide, you should be on the right path for ensuring civil rights compliance and will likely avoid having to go down the road of dealing with a civil rights complaint. But at least, if you do end up in that position for one reason or another, if you follow these steps, you'll have a clear and well-communicated policy in place and procedures for how to handle any complaints that you may receive. This concludes today's presentation on civil rights requirements in the CACFP. To access any templates or forms referenced during this training, please visit the RIDE Child Nutrition Program's website at the link found on screen. If you have any questions related to this training or other CACFP topics, please contact your RIDE program specialist or email our General Child Nutrition inbox at the email address found on the screen. Thank you.